Before the pyramids touched the sky, before pharaohs claimed eternity in stone, quiet hands were already pressing history into wet clay. What if the oldest written records on Earth don't begin with Egypt at all, but with people who believed the world was already ancient when they arrived? Stay with this story, and you'll drift back to a time when civilization was not being born, but carefully remembered, before Egypt raised its first stone monuments, before the Nile's kings learned to carve their names into eternity. There was already a quiet world keeping records beside two rivers farther east. You are standing in southern Mesopotamia, in a land where water must be coaxed into fields by canals, and where survival depends less on divine spectacle than on careful planning. The people here do not imagine themselves at the beginning of time. They believe, calmly and without drama, that much has already happened. The ground beneath your feet is flat and silty, deposited by floods that come regularly and without apology. Villages cluster on irrigation channels, their mud brick walls constantly repaired after each season. Nothing here feels permanent, and perhaps that is why the people develop a deep concern with memory. They begin pressing small wedge-shaped marks into clay, not to tell stories at first, but to keep track of grain, sheep, labor, and time. These tablets are unassuming objects, meant to be held in one hand, dried in the sun, stacked on shelves. Yet they carry something that stone monuments do not: secrets. The earliest scribes do not call themselves historians. They are administrators trained from childhood to reproduce signs precisely, to count accurately, to copy older tablets without altering them. Their job is continuity. If a canal repair was recorded 10 years ago, it must be readable 10 years from now. If a temple distributed barley last season, it must be verifiable next season. Writing emerges as a tool for stability in a landscape that rarely provides it. As generations pass, these tablets accumulate. They are stored, reused, buried, rediscovered, and recopied. Over time, the scribes begin to write not only about the present, but about the remembered past. Lists of officials become lists of rulers. Records of temple overseers become records of kings. Names extend backward, farther than living memory can reach. This does not trouble the scribes. They copy what they have inherited. One such inheritance is the idea that kingship itself has a history independent of any one city. In several surviving texts, kingship is described almost like a physical object, something that can move from place to place. It begins in one city, then shifts to another, carried not by armies, but by time itself. This way of thinking is subtle but important. Power is not eternal. It travels. When scribes compile what modern scholars call the Sumerian king list, they do so with the same steady hand they use for accounting. There is no change in tone when the text moves from familiar rulers to those who belong to a much earlier age. The list opens with a simple statement: after kingship descended from heaven, it was in a city called Eridu. The phrase is written without explanation. It is not highlighted or defended. It is simply there. Then come the names of kings who ruled for astonishing lengths of time. Tens of thousands of years are assigned to single reigns. To a modern reader, these numbers feel symbolic or mythical. To the ancient scribe, they are just numbers, written in the same numerical system used to measure barley or land. There is no indication that these reigns were meant to be questioned. They belong to a time before a great dividing event, a flood that reshaped the world. The flood itself is mentioned briefly in the king list, almost as a logistical note. After the flood swept over the land, kingship resumed in another city. History continues. The scribes do not dwell on destruction. They do not moralize. They record. This calm treatment of catastrophe reveals something about how ancient Mesopotamians understood time. They expected disruption. Floods destroyed crops regularly. Cities fell. Dynasties collapsed. Continuity did not mean permanence. It meant recovery. The idea that the world had existed in different forms before their own time felt natural. Other Sumerian and later Akkadian texts expand on the flood in more narrative ways, describing divine counsels, warnings, and survival. But even these stories are rooted in lived experience. Floods were not theoretical. They were annual threats. The memory of a great flood became a way to talk about vulnerability, not about the end of history. What is striking is that nowhere in these records did the scribes claim that Sumer was the first civilization. Instead, they present Sumer as the current holder of kingship, inheriting a role that existed long before them. The past is layered. The present sits on top of earlier presents, each one real in its own time. While Mesopotamian scribes are developing this sense of deep chronology, Egypt is still forming along the Nile. Early Egyptian communities farm, trade, and bury their dead with care. But they leave behind fewer written records of sequence in the earliest periods. When Egyptian writing emerges, it serves a different purpose. It emphasizes divine order, ritual repetition, and the timeless nature of kingship. Pharaohs are not simply rulers in a list. They are embodiments of cosmic balance. This contrast matters. Sumerian records focus on duration and succession. Egyptian records focus on continuity and harmony. One civilization counts time forward and backward. The other seeks to stand outside it. By the time Egypt builds its first pyramids, cities like Uruk and Ur have already experienced centuries of urban life. Temples have been rebuilt multiple times. Dynasties have risen and fallen. Writing has evolved. Trade networks span vast distances. Sumerian scribes, looking backward, already see themselves as living in a later age. Their daily lives reinforce this perspective. A farmer measures his field knowing it may flood next year. A merchant travels knowing routes change. A king rules knowing his city may one day lose kingship to another. Stability is always provisional. This acceptance of impermanence shapes how history is recorded. When scribes copy ancient lists, they preserve even elements that no longer make practical sense. A king ruling for 36,000 years remains part of the record, not because it can be verified, but because it belongs to the inherited structure of time. The scribe's loyalty is to tradition, not plausibility. Over centuries, Sumerian becomes a learned language rather than a spoken one, much like Latin in medieval Europe. New empires rise, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, but they continue to copy Sumerian texts. They learn Sumerian signs. They memorize ancient hymns. They reproduce the king list. The past remains present through repetition. Egyptian civilization, developing alongside and sometimes interacting with Mesopotamia, takes a different approach to memory. Pharaohs build monuments meant to last forever. Names are carved in stone. Time is presented as cyclical, renewing with each reign. The emphasis is not on what came before, but on maintaining order now. To later observers, Egypt appears timeless, while Mesopotamia feels ancient. This impression is shaped not just by dates, but by attitudes toward history. Sumerian records openly acknowledge that their world is not the first and will not be the last. When Greek historians later write about Egypt, they marvel at its antiquity. When modern archaeologists excavate Mesopotamia, they uncover layers beneath layers, each one representing a different era of occupation. The ground itself becomes a record of succession. The idea that Sumerian records describe a world older than Egypt does not rest on claims of lost technology or forgotten super-civilizations. It rests on something quieter, the habit of writing down what came before, even when it no longer fits neatly into the present. In these tablets, you see people who understood that history was long, uneven, and fragile. They did not imagine a single golden beginning. They imagined continuity broken by disaster, followed by rebuilding. Civilization was not a miracle. It was maintenance. As you sit with this perspective, listening to the steady rhythm of recorded names and reigns, You may begin to feel how different this view of the past is from modern expectations. There is no dramatic revelation, no sudden enlightenment. There is only accumulation. The Sumerians did not ask whether they were the first civilization. The question would not have made sense to them. They assumed others had existed before, just as others would exist after. Their task was not to claim primacy, but to keep the record intact. Clay tablets dry quietly in the sun. Floodwaters come and go. Cities rise, fall, and rise again. Far to the west, Egypt will soon build monuments that command attention for millennia. But here, between two rivers, memory is preserved in smaller, more modest forms. And it is in these modest forms that you find a worldview older than pyramids, older than pharaohs, a worldview that accepts deep time not as a mystery to be solved, but as a condition of living. And as this story slowly comes to rest, imagine the clay tablets being set down, the lamps dimming, and the ancient world growing quiet once more. If these calm journeys into forgotten history help you unwind, drift, or simply rest your thoughts, you're always welcome here. This is quiet, boring sleep, where history moves gently and nothing rushes you. If you'd like to keep falling asleep to quiet stories like this, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these slow, peaceful histories coming. Thank you for listening, and wherever you are, I hope the night treats you kindly.